Thank you for joining us today. I'm Gary Morishima, the U.S. Section Co-Chair of the Coho-Tech Committee. I'm privileged and honored to welcome you to the third seminar of a series on environmental change hosted by the Pacific Salmon Commission. We're going to try a little different format for this seminar with Q&A following each speaker. The audio and voice, the audio and chat are disabled, so please use the Q&A to ask any questions. I'm going to give you a few words of introduction and then introduce our two speakers of the day. We have Teresa Ryan and Eric Quaempts will be providing us with some of their perspectives on salmon management and some of the challenges that have faced the First Nations and tribes over the years. But salmon have been in the rivers of the Northwest for really millions of years, but their ability to continue to thrive in the future is very much in doubt. It's important to know about different ways of thinking, saying, knowing, and doing as we seek a path to contend with the challenges of environmental change. The topic of the day is Indigenous knowledge systems. I'm excited by the chance to hear perspectives of First Stewards from Canada and the Columbia River on how they care for their relatives, the salmon, as co-managers of shared resources. Our speakers will give us a chance to open our eyes to an alternative worldview, a holistic one of interconnectedness and relationships, one that is practiced through language, traditional knowledge, customs, ceremonies, and beliefs passed from generation to generation, sustaining the environment, cultures, economies, and communities for thousands of years. Our first speaker, Dr. Teresa Ryan, Tsimshian, is a traditional cedar bark weaver, an accomplished photographer, a researcher at the University of British Columbia, and a member of the PSC Chinook Technical Committee. She has a PhD in resource management and environmental studies, a master's in natural resource management, and a bachelor's in biology of fisheries and aquatic ecology. She examined the colonial dispossession of Aboriginal lands and trade for her dissertation and demonstrated how the ecological and social harmony enjoyed by Aboriginal peoples was dismantled, with enormous cost to them, to their natural resources, and colonial society. Teresa works with First Nations in coastal British Columbia and participates in the Advisory Committee for Climate Action and the Environment, an Assembly of First Nations Chiefs Committee. She also participates in a local Indigenous technical analysis network through the First Nations Fisheries Council, the First Nations Caucus of the Pacific Salmon Commission, and serves as a senior policy advisor to the Native Brotherhood of British Columbia. Teresa is currently investigating relationships between salmon and healthy forests and revitalizing traditional Indigenous stewardship in the Salmon Forest Project, which is funded by the Donner Foundation. So Teresa, take it away.
Thank you, Gary. Simhayets Dawayu. Nawalps Bihanax Dawatsogu. Gitlan Simjian Dawawatku. My name is Simhayetsk, Teresa Ryan, and I'm from the Gitlan tribe of the Tsimshian Nation. I'm happy to be here today. I'm going to tell you some story of Dim Kam Als Ganu, the Kwan, Spanax Nooks, Simhon. I'm going to tell you a story about supernatural salmon. Indigenous knowledge systems are incredibly immense. They're vast. We're talking about a way of life for Indigenous people. And usually when you hear about a knowledge system, one of the things that comes to mind is ontology. And another one, element is epistemology. And these are terms that we use to describe forms of knowledge. So for an ontological perspective on salmon, there's already things that have been shared from an Indigenous worldview. A couple hundred years ago, salmon is good food, right? That was shared to people that arrived early in the colonial endeavor. And there was different types of salmon that were shared. The locations of where those salmon were and the run timing was also important information to access these wonderful creatures. And of course, how they reproduce, the spawning in those locations in streams and in lakes. And also where salmon rear, where the juveniles start to emerge from the eggs and where they are in river systems and in lakes and where they are out in the estuary. But one of the important things that we have from an Indigenous perspective and our worldview is relationships. And so I'm going to give you some information about relationships on salmon from our worldview. Typically, people think of our knowledge as it's handed down from generation to generation. And it is, but it's much more complicated than just a simple transmission. Oral tradition is a strong component of what we know today and what has been known in the past. And that was a primary means of this transmission of our knowledge. But there are other locations for sourcing our knowledge systems within our own communities. Our stories hold much information. I'm going to give you an example of a story. And also, there's having the action of fishing every year, having that opportunity when it arises, continues to propagate knowledge and how we transmit our knowledge. And of course, we find our knowledge in landscapes and in seascapes, and the plants and the animals and fish that live in those areas. I'll show you examples of this. We know that Aboriginal knowledge is a different form of knowledge. And what I like to show is this depiction, a visualization of Indigenous knowledge or Aboriginal knowledge as a circle where something that's depicted in the inside could be a person, it could be a fish, it could be a tree, but it's connected to everything around it. And so there's this continual cyclic relationship with knowledge and its relation or things that are related to each other. And you compare that on the right side to a box, we can consider science as a linear type of a knowledge, just for comparison purposes. And we can actually have hundreds or thousands of boxes that depict an institutional type knowledge. And so when we look at it this way, we can see they are completely different. And it's the round peg, square hole doesn't always fit. But when people are working with both systems and working together, in the center of that, you can find that place of mediation where you can find shared common information that's useful for whatever the purpose might be. So this was difficult to get this image onto a screen. These are salmon areas. It doesn't include all of them, unfortunately, because it's a small screen. But this is all the way around the Pacific Ocean. And this depicts knowledge systems. I got this from ecotrust.org. So just to give you an idea of how many different knowledge systems there are for salmon. When we think about the salmon forest, this is one of the projects that I work on at UBC Forestry. It extends from the Yukon all the way around Alaska and down into California. That's our salmon forest region. And of course, many of you know where salmon are, being part of the Salmon Commission. So my research started when I was doing a master's degree and looking at the sea sweetgrass plant in Grays Harbor, Washington. My grandmother remembered going by canoe from Prince Rupert to Grays Harbor for this plant, specifically for this plant. And of course, when we gather it now, we get permission from the Quinault tribe. And we also are working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the Grays Harbor Wildlife Refuge. So this is what the plant bed looks like. And there are certain ways to harvest it. And you cannot cut it because that'll destroy it. So you have to leave the root intact. But the interesting thing about this plant and our use of it is that it gives us, when we're out harvesting, it gives us information about salmon. Because when the tide comes in and inundates this plant bed, in with the water comes juvenile salmon. And so that's an indication to us of the health of salmon populations. We have to stop harvesting right then and there when the water comes in to protect the salmon. So we can come back at another time when the tide goes out. So that was my master's thesis, and that was my first foray into our knowledge systems and the difference with science. In our knowledge systems, we also have taxonomy and the way that we categorize and classify things in our languages. Language is a storage mechanism for Indigenous knowledge. And then these words are just the Tsimshian language. Remember that map I showed you of all the different knowledge groups? Those are all different knowledge or language as well. We're not going to read through those. We also store knowledge in names of things. This is one of my grandmother's names, Ashlalod. And what it means is the killer whales all line up as they rise to the surface. So that's just an interesting little piece of information, right? But it's stored in a name, in a woman's name. Now, the Cowichan have this story about a supernatural killer whale that had showed up in the Cowichan River. They didn't know what was going on. They're waiting at the salmon grounds for the salmon to come in, and there's no fish at all. So somebody finally went down to the mouth of the Cowichan River and found this supernatural killer whale. And he's just chomping on the Chinook salmon, one after another. And the people were mortified because what are they going to eat? So they got out their drums and they brought the shamans to the river and they started chanting. And they called on the supernatural Thunderbird with all their might. They called the supernatural Thunderbird to come and take the orca away, the supernatural orca, so that they could have salmon swim up the stream for themselves and also for spawning. So this is an example of one of the stories that populate this whole region in the people of the salmon. We all have stories that are similar. The technology that we used in the past has been very sophisticated. You can see that this young man is holding something that would fit in a stream right in a thalliwag. The salmon wouldn't even see it there, right? And that was one way to trap salmon. Enoch here is in front of a wall that's literally a trap for salmon. It's quite large. So you can see that we can catch a lot of fish. Here's a 3-story smokehouse structure. And just to give you an idea of how big this is, over here on this left side, there's a family standing here. That's a lot of fish. So clearly there's much more fish that was perhaps available then that we're taking and smoking and doing what we do with it, right? This is another interesting picture of the past. I like to show this because of the uniformity of these Chinook. They're all large, they're beautiful, right? And these are baboon fish. And of course the June hogs. There's many people who have never heard of June hogs, and that's so sad because they're gone. And this is one of my favorite pictures to display because of the size of them. We don't get to see these so much anymore. And this is what our orcas, the southern resident killer whales, are missing in their diet. Well, this here is one of the ways that we could actually ensure that large fish would go upstream. This is at Fraser Lake. It drops into the Nechako up north. And these guys are guardians. And what they're doing on this weir that's crossing the whole river and would intimidate people at the time that they're blocking fish or taking all the fish was an inaccurate assessment, because what they're doing is making sure that certain fish are passing through a sluice, and particularly the large fish. Now, for example, if we allow a large female to go upriver, she's going to have a higher fecundity. She's going to have more eggs, right? We allow large males to go up too, then their progeny are also going to be large fish. This was one of the advantages of having the large fish escape. One of the things that I suggested at a BFO Wild Salmonic Policy workshop so long ago was to overlay a map of languages, of Aboriginal languages, over the proposed conservation unit maps. And there are several different types of maps depending on species and depending on salmon type, ocean stream type, etc. So this is just an example. And you can see that there is some alignment, and that's a good place to start to try and understand where you want to source some knowledge. Now, I'm going to describe to you how our knowledge systems are tied to our landscape a little bit, because this is really important in understanding our stewardship. So I'm Tsimshian, and we have our hereditary system of inheritance is strictly matrilineal. So I follow my mother, Bilhamnech Wasnoyu. Bilhamnech is my mother. And I follow her in line of everything that I identify myself with. My Gitlan tribe of the Tsimshian Nation, my Raven clan, Ganhada. That's all because that's what my mother is. And the Tlingit and the Haida are also strictly matrilineal. There is no other inheritance structure in these groups. Other groups have different ways of inheritance. And we don't have enough time to go into those in more detail today. But these are what's celebrated at our feast events, also known as a potlatch. And those were outlawed in Canada until 1957. And then the law was repealed. But this is our social institution where we actually demonstrate a whole bunch of things. We conduct our business. We call it, we refer to it as taking care of business. It's social transactions. It's things like putting names on people. It's elevating a young man to a chieftainship. It's rites of passage. You could have a feast for a marriage or memorial feast. So there are a variety of reasons to have feasts, and we have different words for them. Yauch is one of our Tsimshian words. Lu Git is another. So it just depends on what the purpose of those feasts would be. And at these events, we have to transmit stories of our heritage, our identity, and the whole social institution. We have to carry on the information. Remember that passing down of information? This is one of those locations where we actually do that transmission of knowledge, is at a feast event. And also, this is a demonstration of the chiefs showing they're taking care of resources, that they're taking care of people. And there are obligations in the wealth of the lands. In this image, you see a being that's carrying a basket on his back that has a copper inside of it. It's a copper shield, and it's our highest symbol of wealth on the north coast of British Columbia and Southeast Alaska, is the copper shield. And what this being is demonstrating is how heavy the obligations are for that wealth in the basket. And this is what has to be demonstrated at the feast, that these obligations are being met. So we also have symbolism that's significant in understanding our worldviews as well. In this copper symbol, which is that highest symbol of wealth, is a T. You see it about the middle, and then the bar is vertical going down. That T represents balance. And it's important to have balance in everything that we do. There's always balance. And we hear often, about looking after the 7 generations. Well, it's a little more complicated than that even. We take the knowledge of the 7 generations before us and we apply it to what we're doing now so that 7 generations in the future have the same benefits that we do. That's the balance. We have to make sure that we are being generous with the ecological services of the forest, of the waters, of everything that's in there to make sure that we're going to have abundance. Now, I'm going to explain that a little bit more because this is an important part of that feast system and our hereditary systems and how we are actually programmed to create a surplus production of our resources. And this is how we have been successful for thousands of years on this coast and with salmon. So the Salmon Forest Project is another one that I work on at the University of British Columbia in forestry, forest and conservation sciences. And I get to share with you just a little bit of activities that I am looking at through trying to reinvigorate some of our traditional technologies and harvesting strategies. But the really interesting part that you might like today is about the tidal pulse fishing. And Steve, he was my committee exam. Oh, the guy at University of Alaska, Steve. It'll come to me later. He's done some work on tidal pulse fishing as well. So it's one of the things that's really important to this is understanding cycles. And we have this keen observation of cycles, and the moon plays a critical role. And we also watch for other activity. The bird life is following cycles of seasons. Willikin is an example that we combine all of these things that we're watching for when birds show up at, for example, the Skeena River en masse, and there are so many birds. We know that the Willikin are following. They're right there. And of course, they're followed by the killer whales and the seals and the sea lions and fish. Weather is another clue. And of course, salmon. So let's talk more about the moon. Many indigenous cultures rely on cycles of the moon. And we actually did too. We still do, but we also have this other interruption in our regulatory management. But the moon, how on earth would we be looking at the moon for our fishing? Here's how it worked. This is just a graph of a tidal cycle. We've got depths on the right, and down at the bottom, you've got times, and at the top, there's days of the week across the top. And I often compare this to one of the bell curves from the Fraser Sockeye Pink analyses every year to show the days of the week and the run timing, and you get this nice bell curve, right? And that's usually what we fish to, is the bell curve, theoretically. But in this case, if we're talking about indigenous fishing, we're fishing to a tidal cycle. And so we would fish literally at one point during this day or 24-hour deal period, where the rest of the time at these high tide intervals, the fish are escaping. So we're only fishing this part of, this is on the coast specifically, we're only fishing a certain part, and this is how it was done. What you're looking at here is a tidal stone trap. See, this all extends all the way out here, and the river is actually over on this side, on the left. And so the tide comes in, inundates this wall, and actually will cover it. You won't see it. The fish don't see it. So they're going up to spawn, and they get through, and then the tide goes out, and then it comes back in, it goes back out again. And when the salmon are running, they can be entrained in this pool, and we can just go in and pick up the fish that we want. We might leave the large fish so that they can go up and spawn, right? It's got to be the most efficient passive technology. This is on the Central Coast near Bella Bella. It's in Heiltsuk territory. And they've documented over 300 of these structures. And of course, the regulations through time have changed, but this is the technology that I'm working to reinvigorate to see if we can actually increase an abundance of salmon stocks in this river. So here's another example of a river mouth, and instead of being in the salt water, it's up right inside of the river, and it's just dug out. This would be a pool where salmon would show up after the tide went out. You can see all the tidal debris on the sides of the banks there. So we're not the only ones that fish. Kermode here has taken his favorite piece of salmon up into the forest, to a bear bench, I call it, and he's going to eat his favorite parts. These critters, turns out, can be picky when there's lots of salmon. And when they're done, it decomposes into the forest floor. Other animals will come along and pick a piece here and there, including little birds, but the salmon decompose and they go into the forest and deliver the marine-derived nitrogen, heavy isotope of nitrogen, N15, into the forest. And of course, that gets into the trees. And that's part of the Salmon Forest Project too. We've actually measured it. And Alan LaRocque has just successfully defended his dissertation on the nitrogen content in the forest and other elements as well. Heilfeld and Nyman did a study in Alaska and found that there was more marine-derived nitrogen when bears are present. So it's bears that are delivering it. It's not just salmon showing up in the river. It's the predators that are delivering this marine-derived nitrogen into the forest. And we've related this to the mother tree because this is another project I work on with Suzanne Simard. The dominant tree in the forest has an integral role to nutrient distribution throughout a forest. This isn't new to Aboriginal people, Indigenous people. Subier of the Skokomish tribe talks about how the forest can teach us about their connections below ground and how they hold the community together. That gives us a stronger community. So back to the real quickly, these roots can exchange nitrogen, water. We have actually documented and published these exchanges, these chemical exchanges, including allelic compounds and defense signals. And it turns out that the tree that is distributing carbon and nitrogen to seedlings tends to favor their own seedlings compared to other seedlings that are nearby, also published in the literature. So this is how the Mother Tree Project has come about to have the name Mother Tree. And mother is not new to forestry either. Tsuga is actually the Japanese word for mother. So Tsuga heterophylla, a hemlock tree. Let's see. So what have we seen with salmon? This was in October that the Yukon River tribes did not have any Chinook or chum show up in their river for the first time. They've just never had that experience. And they literally have no fish in their freezers. And they have to source other types of foods. So this is at one end of the range. And then of course, the other end of the range would be the Central Valley in California that have also been struggling for years, as many people know. This is also up in the Yukon. I took this picture flying over a river. So when we think about the changes that we see to some of these populations, it's pretty clear that some of the changes have been incredible negative impacts. We're all familiar with climate change, those of us salmon scientists that are on the call. And so this is just an example picture. But here is a picture about the 1880s on the Nass River of fishing for ulican. And they are standing on ice. We don't see that anymore. We don't see that level of ice. There is ice when winters, does freeze up and it melts and comes down the rivers, both Nass and Skeena when we're ulican fishing in big chunks, right? But it's not as intense as it used to be, and we don't see this freeze up. So we've seen this for a long time. On the interior, we've got these interior snow-dominated hydrographs, and I pilfered this slide and the next one from a DFO slide. I have no shame. But what we're seeing is that these shifts in the snow regimes are affecting salmon, whether it's diminishing the hyporheic zones below ground in the watersheds, or even the scouring that's occurring at the surface as well. And there's other reasons for it. Now, a lot of the hydrographs that we're seeing changes in are due to forestry. And I love this picture to show you how big these root systems can be for one tree, and understand how much water can be held by this tree. So when we remove these trees, then we're losing that ability to hold that hydrology. As when we think about this winter or the snow hydrographs, I like this picture because it shows a cycle. And this is something that we've been working with Indigenous knowledge systems, is these cycles, right? And so it's good that we're starting to see in science that there is a recognition of cycles, because this is what's missing in our science, is these cycles. So we're seeing a lot of our forests change drastically, detrimentally. The clear cutting has caused, we're looking at generations of salmon that have been impacted. Here's an example of Douglas Lake area in 1984. You can see that there's some patterns of harvest here. There were some experiments going on too about that time. But here's some harvest and harvest. But here is 2018. So 1984, 2018. This has to affect the fish in the watersheds. It absolutely has to. We know that we've got endangered species in the Columbia, Puget Sound, and now Canada's CTUIR has evaluated 16 stocks of Chinook in the Fraser, and 8 they identified as endangered, 4 threatened. And there's a process continuing right now on looking at some of those Fraser stocks in a recovery potential assessment that is part of the SARA Species at Risk Act process. You see a picture here of a Chinook that is depicts the Okanagan Chinook, where the Okanagan people were able to share the difference in salmon that they have identified is by looking at the face of the salmon. That is just so cool. As scientists, we often don't get to see fish at all, but when we're using our Indigenous knowledge systems and we're actually practicing our fishing technologies, this is one of the things that we're looking for in identifying fish, right? They have a different face. These are the areas that are, of course, ESA listed species. We don't need to go into there, sorry. I wanted to give one last little example here of, remember this sea sweetgrass plant that I was standing in, and it is a part of juvenile salmon habitat. That was in Grace Harbor. And what we see here is a Corps of Engineers diagram of what's around Bowerman Basin. This is Bowerman Basin, the wildlife refuge. And along this shoreline is where that plant would be, that my grandmother went by canoe to go down to retrieve. And so these are where dredge deposit was put on this. And this created Bowerman Spit. There's the airport there, there's an industrial area there. And the wildlife refuge is in here. But what that's done is created this whole terrestrial system that's cut off the freshwater flows over that salt marsh. So it has caused change. That's salmon habitat. How do you undo that? This is like an 1846 map of the same watershed. And don't mind the terminology they used at the time. They called it Useless Bay. But this is where the salt marsh is, and that's that plant population. And it's now covered by this spit that goes way out here. And it's how do you undo that? So this is obviously something that we've been watching. Reciprocity is really important to us in giving and generosity and giving more, taking only what you need, right? This is a woman that is returning salmon bones into the water because from a Tsimshian worldview, that salmon spirit is going to go back into the ocean to its village where it has a longhouse and family and a chief all under sea. That's the supernatural salmon. We have a connection to these salmon through our belief systems and through our stewardship. And that's critically important for us to make sure that we have salmon in the future. So that's it for my portion of the talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. That was a wonderful talk. I wish we had more time and you could expand on your knowledge. So my name is Teresa Litz, and I'm one of the steering committee members of the Pacific Salmon Commission Seminar Series, and I am going to be helping to moderate the Q&A for Teresa for about the next 10 minutes. So I remind audience members to ask questions in the Q&A box. And there's no questions currently. So Teresa, I have a question for you. And you had mentioned something before the seminar started that really resonated with me. And could you tell the audience something about the biggest challenges in explaining what Indigenous knowledge systems are, or maybe what they are not to Western audiences?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I get asked that frequently because, you know, as a scientist, we expect we can just go look at some peer-reviewed literature, we can pick up a book, we can read about it, right? And you can't necessarily do that with Indigenous knowledge systems. And here's a really good example. The background behind me is a totem pole. Now I can read that. I'm fluent in reading totem pole, right? But other people don't know what those figures are. And for us to convey our knowledge it's a part of expressing our culture. It's in maintaining our identity, and it's making sure that we're living up to those obligations. We have to take care of things. So it's a way of life. It comes down to a way of life. And it isn't something that we can write in a book. And believe me, I've been trying to publish this stuff for years. It just doesn't go into peer review very well. And I'm not also being reviewed by my peers. We don't have a lot of us that are, you know, in the sciences that are engaged in that. So it's difficult to have that written on one part. The other part is that we've, you know, lost quite a bit, right, already in our lands and access to resources and our cultures, and sadly, children were taken away. So giving our knowledge away is out of the question. And it has to be maintained in that fluid application of use. We want to make sure that we're perpetuating and our knowledge systems, including our social systems that within which they are held, for the future, or the benefits of the future. So I think that's what I would say is the difference. I don't think there's only one specific answer. And I know that if I told you, Joanna Meninek from Yakima told me once, when I asked her, what's the difference? You know, I said, what are cultural resources to you? Because at the time it was the Interior Columbia Basin Quaempts thing that was engaged in, and cultural resources came up as a topic. And I kept asking people what they had thought cultural resources were, because we had an archaeologist come into one of my master's classes and explain what they thought cultural resources were, which was not consistent with what an Indigenous worldview would think of cultural resources. And Joanna Meninek says, you know, I can't tell you in English what it means, but I could tell you in Sahaptin, and then it would make sense, right? And that's the same way. If I could speak in Somali, I can tell you, it would be a completely different answer.
Thank you.
So we have a question from Joe Oatman, who's a Nez Perce tribal member. What are First Nations, or where are First Nations at in trying to develop fish walls for harvesting once again? It was impressive to see the traditional way of fishing in those areas along coastal rivers.
It is. It's awesome to see this. The Heiltsuk have been documenting these, and we're just getting to them. We're just starting to redeploy these, and it's going to take a massive effort because the way that the land is governed now is different, and it's going to require archaeology permits. It's going to require some excavation at some sites. We've got to bring in some heavy equipment. We've got to remove some sediment, and it's going to take permits, and it's going to take planning. And unfortunately, the pandemic has really hurt us because we can't go into these remote coastal communities as freely as we did before the pandemic. So I'm hoping that the pandemic will end anytime soon so we can get back into this. The other thing I'm just gonna add, the tidal stone traps you see in the Central Coast and north up into the Tlingit territory. And up in Tlingit territory, you start seeing a lot of wooden weirs in the intertidal area as well. And then below the Quaempts areas, you see a lot of the wooden weirs that are made. So the stone traps are mostly in that central portion, which would be the central North British Columbia coast. That doesn't mean that they're not elsewhere. They are, but as extensive numbers of them are on the central coast for sure.
Thanks, Teresa. So we have time for one more question, but first I just want to note that Paul McCollum said, I don't have a question, but I really, really appreciate your talk and how important this talk is. Thank you. So the question comes from Sanjeev Joshi. You showed the picture of Nass River in the 1880s, indicating that currently the river does not hold ice like that anymore. Can you explain a bit about what are the impacts on salmon of going from snow-dominated to rain-dominated systems?
The impact on salmon. That's an interesting question. I think with rain-dominated systems, you have more risk of scouring, just like you do now with what we're seeing in the interior watersheds is that these rain on snow events are washing away the rain much faster. It's melting faster. And then, so you have a higher velocity of water going through the watershed and scouring out redds, right? So when you have more rain, you have a higher volume. And when you have less snow. And what we're seeing actually, and this is, now I'm starting to get into opinion, what we're seeing is, because I'm not studying this directly, is less snow in the winter. And then we have these higher volume rain events on less snow. So it just becomes more of rainwater washing down into the river. And what we're going to see is that the low summer flows are going to be the lowest they've ever been each year as this progresses, right? And what that's doing is depleting the underground water systems. So, and the aquifers below them, right? So there's going to be a loss of interaction in these hydrology systems that support salmon. That when Chinook go up into a river, they prefer areas of upwelling, both for resting periods and also for laying their eggs. They depend on the upwelling of groundwater to aerate and keep a constant temperature. And without the groundwater, then it's not going to be optimal conditions.
Thank you for that answer and for a really fascinating seminar. I think at this point, we're going to turn to our second speaker. So Gary, can you do the introduction?
Sure. Well, our second speaker is Eric Quaempts. He's a member of the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation in Oregon. His interests include family, fly fishing, photography, biking, traveling, cooking, and dining, fine or otherwise. As the director of the Umatillas Department of Natural Resources since 2004, he developed and implemented the First Foods Management Approach and River Vision. Eric currently serves on the Oregon Water Resources Commission. He has an interdisciplinary background in forestry, wildlife range, reforestation, fisheries, and fire management. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Wildlife Science from Oregon State and attended graduate schools at Colorado State University. Eric's topic today is using a system of ecological knowledge to guide first foods management. So Eric, it's all yours.